Welcome to HOA Karen Patrol. The fine meter started before I even grabbed the shovel. You cannot leave this sidewalk like that. Fix it now. I looked up from the sidewalk I had just cleared for the third time that morning and saw Tiffany Cooper standing at the end of my driveway with her phone aimed at me like a weapon. She was already scrolling, already typing, already building her case before I even opened my mouth. I had been outside for maybe 20 minutes, doing what every other homeowner in the Commons at Ridgeview was doing after the overnight snowfall, and now she was treating me like I had committed a crime. She jabbed a finger toward the small mound of snow I had pushed to the edge of my property line, right next to the community sign that marked the entrance to our street. The pile was maybe 8 inches high and entirely on my side of the invisible border that separated my driveway from the HOA common area. It was not blocking anything. It was not even touching the sign. But Tiffany did not care about facts. She cared about control. I work as an airline baggage supervisor at the main terminal, so I have seen every kind of chaos, every type of meltdown, every flavor of unreasonable demand. I thought that experience would prepare me for dealing with an HOA. I was wrong. Tiffany had been the fines and enforcement coordinator for the Commons at Ridgeview HOA board for 2 years, and in that time, she had perfected the art of turning minor infractions into full-scale emergencies. She bragged about her collections numbers at every meeting. She printed violation notices on colored paper so they would stand out in your mailbox. She had a retractable badge reel clipped to her coat with a blank card that she treated like a police shield, even though it had no authority whatsoever. And now, she was standing in my driveway, breath visible in the freezing air, telling me I had violated some emergency snow rule I had never heard of. I leaned the small, collapsible snow pusher against the garage door and walked toward her. My elderly father was staying with me for the winter while he recovered from a hip surgery, and the stress of this HOA nonsense was already wearing on him. He had asked me twice this week if we were going to lose the house over some fine, and I had told him no. Of course not. But the truth was, I did not know what Tiffany was capable of. She had sent vendors to my door without notice to verify compliance before. She had left notes on my car windshield. She had called the management company to complain about my mailbox placement, my trash can timing, and the color of my holiday wreath. And now, she was standing here with that smug look on her face, holding her phone like it was a courtroom exhibit. Tiffany tapped her screen twice and then looked up at me with that signature expression she always wore when she thought she had won. "Your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead," she said. I did not know what she was talking about yet, but I knew it was going to be expensive. She turned her phone toward me and showed me a photo she had just taken. It was my snow pile, but the angle made it look like I had dumped half a truckload right up against the community sign. She had crouched down low and shot it from an inch away, making the perspective scream violation. The sign itself was not even visible in the shot, just the base post and a wall of white that looked like I had buried a landmark. It was a staged photo, pure manipulation, and she knew it. She swiped to another screen and started reading out loud from some document I had never seen. "Emergency Winter Enforcement Protocol," she said, voice rising with each word. "Any accumulation of snow or ice within 3 feet of HOA signage, pathways, or designated snow routes is subject to immediate citation and mandatory cleanup at owner expense. You are in violation as of this moment. I will be billing you for cleanup. The fee is $250, and if it is not cleared by noon today, it goes to $500. I stared at her. The snow pile was maybe 3 feet wide and sitting entirely on my property. The community sign was a good 4 feet away, and even if it were closer, the pile was not blocking anything. Cars were driving past us right now. Pedestrians were walking on the other side of the street. Nobody was being harmed. But Tiffany did not care about harm. She cared about rules, or more specifically, about using rules to justify whatever she wanted to do in the moment. She was running the Winter Safety Committee like a private police force with no authority, and I was about to become her next example. I asked her to show me the rule in writing. She sighed, annoyed that I was wasting her time, and swiped back to another screen. She held the phone up for maybe 2 seconds, not long enough for me to actually read anything, and then pulled it away. "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule," she said. That line hit me like a slap. It was not just rude, it was a threat. She was telling me that my input, my explanation, my evidence, none of it mattered. She had already decided I was guilty, and now she was just going through the motions to make it official. I heard the truck before I saw it. A flatbed tow rig turned the corner at the end of the block and rolled toward us, amber lights flashing. My stomach dropped. Tiffany had not just come here to yell at me. She had come here to escalate. The truck slowed and pulled up behind my car, which was parked in my own driveway, on my own property, nowhere near a fire lane or a no parking zone. The driver, a guy in a reflective vest and a thick jacket, climbed out and walked toward Tiffany. She pointed at my car and said something I could not hear, but I saw him nod and pull a clipboard from the cab. This was insane. She was trying to tow my car while I was standing right here, in the middle of shoveling my own driveway, because she claimed I had piled snow too close to a sign. I walked straight to the driver and asked him who authorized the tow. He glanced at Tiffany and then back at me. She said the HOA has a standing contract for enforcement tows. He said. I told him that was not an answer. I asked him if he had a signed work order, a violation notice, anything official. He hesitated. Tiffany stepped in and said she did not need a work order. She had board authority, and the truck was here because I was non-compliant. I pulled out my phone and opened the HOA portal, scrolling to the parking section of the rules. There was nothing about towing for snow violations. There was nothing about emergency cleanup fees. I showed the driver the screen. He looked uncomfortable. Tiffany snapped at him to ignore me and hooked the car anyway. That was when I told him I would call the police if he touched my vehicle without a valid work order. He looked at Tiffany, then at me, then at the house behind us where my father was probably watching from the window. He handed the clipboard back to Tiffany and said he needed confirmation before he could proceed. She went red in the face. She started yelling at him, at me, at nobody in particular, saying we were all wasting her time and that this was exactly why enforcement was so hard in this neighborhood. The driver climbed back into his truck and idled there, waiting. Tiffany turned back to me and said this was not over. She took another photo of my car, another photo of the snow pile, and then one more of me standing in my driveway holding my phone. She said all of this was going into my file, and that I should expect an official notice by end of business today. Then she walked back to her car, which was parked halfway down the block, and drove off. The tow truck followed her a minute later. I stood there in the cold, breath fogging in front of my face, trying to process what had just happened. I went inside and found my father sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He asked me if everything was okay. I told him it was fine, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He had been through enough already, and now he was stuck in the middle of an HOA war because Tiffany Cooper had decided I was her next target. I pulled out my laptop and started going through the HOA documents I had saved when I moved in. There was the master deed, the bylaws, the architectural guidelines, the parking rules, the landscaping rules, and a dozen other PDFs that nobody ever read until it was too late. I searched for anything related to snow, ice, winter, or emergency enforcement. There were a few generic lines about maintaining clear walkways and not blocking common areas, but nothing that gave Tiffany the authority to fine me $250 or call a tow truck. I took screenshots of everything and saved them in a folder labeled evidence. I had a plan forming, but I needed time. I also needed help. I remembered that one of the board members, a guy named Eric who lived 3 streets over, had voted against Tiffany on a few issues last year. He was scared of her, most people were, but he had a conscience. I sent him a text asking if we could talk. He did not reply right away. I did not expect him to. Standing up to Tiffany meant becoming her next project, and most people in this neighborhood would rather pay a bogus fine than deal with that headache. An hour later, a notice appeared in my mailbox. It was printed on bright yellow paper, folded once, and stuffed in without an envelope. Violation notice, it said at the top in bold letters. Property address, violation date, violation description, fee amount, payment deadline. Everything was there except a signature. I flipped the page over and saw a handwritten note at the bottom. This is your only warning. Next time it doubles. She had not even tried to make it look official. She had just typed it up herself, printed it at home, and delivered it like she was running the whole HOA from her kitchen table. I took a photo of the notice, front and back, and added it to my evidence folder. The management company portal was down that afternoon. I tried logging in 3 times and kept getting an error page. I called their support line and got a voicemail. I needed to deliver paper proof in person today because the deadline Tiffany had set was noon tomorrow, and I was not going to let this fee slide into collections without a fight. I printed out my screenshots, the parking rules, the violation notice, and a timeline I had started drafting that showed every interaction I had with Tiffany over the past 6 months. I put everything in a folder and drove to the management company office across town. The office was in a strip mall next to a tax prep place and a dry cleaner. I walked in and asked to speak to someone about an HOA enforcement issue. The receptionist, a younger woman with a name tag I could not read from where I stood, told me the account manager for the Commons at Ridgeview was out today, but I could leave documents in the Dropbox. I told her I needed to speak to someone now because I had a deadline. She sighed and said she would see if anyone else was available. 5 minutes later, a guy in a button-down shirt and no tie came out and introduced himself as a compliance officer. I handed him the folder and walked him through everything. The snow pile, the staged photo, the tow truck, the bogus fine, the lack of any rule that supported Tiffany's claim. He flipped through the pages and nodded a few times. He said he would flag it for review, but that enforcement decisions were ultimately up to the board, and the management company could only advise. I asked him what that meant in plain English. He said it meant I should probably show up to the next board meeting and argue my case there. I left the office feeling like I had just wasted an hour. The management company was not going to help. They were going to file my complaint in a drawer and move on to the next issue. If I wanted this to stop, I was going to have to force it myself. I drove home and found Eric's reply waiting on my phone. He said he could talk, but only in person, not over text. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood that evening. Eric looked nervous the moment he walked in. He ordered a coffee, sat down across from me, and immediately started with the disclaimers. He could not vote against Tiffany on anything official without evidence. He could not get dragged into a personal dispute. He could not risk his own standing on the board. I told him I understood all of that, and I was not asking him to take my side. I just needed to know what was happening behind the scenes. He took a long sip of his coffee and then started talking. Tiffany had been pushing for stricter winter enforcement since November. She had drafted a whole set of emergency rules that the board never actually voted on, but she was enforcing them anyway. She had a deal with a plow company, a salt vendor, and a towing contractor, and according to Eric, all three of those vendors were billing the HOA at rates that seemed way too high. He did not have proof, he said, but he had started asking questions at the last meeting, and Tiffany had shut him down hard. She told him he did not have the authority to review vendor contracts. That was her job as enforcement coordinator, and if he kept pushing, she would file a complaint against him for interfering with board operations. I asked Eric if he would testify to any of this if it came to a hearing or a legal dispute. He said maybe, but only if there was already enough evidence that Tiffany could not retaliate. He was scared, and I did not blame him. Tiffany had a way of making people disappear from the board. She had pushed out 2 other members in the past year by filing bogus ethics complaints and making their lives miserable until they resigned. Eric said he would help me quietly, but he could not be my public ally unless I had something that would force the board to act. I told him I was working on it. He finished his coffee and left through the side door. I sat there for another 10 minutes, staring at my phone, thinking about vendor kickbacks and fake emergency rules and how deep this thing really went. When I got home, I found another note on my door. This one was not an official violation notice. It was just a sticky note with Tiffany's handwriting. Non-compliance will result in lien proceedings. I took a photo of the note and added it to the folder. Then I called a lawyer. I had been putting this off because I did not want to spend money on something that might go away on its own. But it was clear now that Tiffany was not going to stop. The attorney I reached specialized in HOA disputes. He listened to my story for about 15 minutes and then told me I had a solid case for harassment and improper enforcement, but that fighting it in court would cost more than just paying the fine. He said the smarter move was to gather as much documentation as possible, file a formal complaint with the board, and escalate to the state HOA ombudsman if the board did nothing. He also said that if I could prove vendor kickbacks, that would change everything, because financial misconduct would force the management company and the board to take action or risk liability. I spent the next 2 days building my case. I requested copies of the vendor contracts through the HOA portal. I filed a formal complaint with the board secretary. I sent a certified letter to the management company outlining Tiffany's behavior and requesting an independent audit of winter enforcement expenses. I also started talking to neighbors. Most of them were too scared to go on record, but a few of them told me stories that matched mine. One guy said Tiffany had fined him for parking in his own driveway during a snowstorm because she claimed it blocked the snowplow route. Another woman said Tiffany had tried to charge her for salt that the HOA plow had spilled on her lawn. A third neighbor said Tiffany had called the city to report a zoning violation that did not exist, just to make his life harder after he complained about her at a meeting. Every story added weight to the pattern I was documenting. Tiffany was not enforcing rules. She was using rules as a weapon to control people and funnel money to her vendor friends. The vendor contracts arrived in my email a week later. They were heavily redacted, with dollar amounts and contact details blacked out, but I could still see enough to know something was wrong. The plow company was billing the HOA per incident, not per season, and the incident rate was 3 times higher than the actual snowfall. The salt vendor was charging commercial rates for residential quantities. The towing contractor had a clause that gave the HOA a percentage kickback on every tow, which I was pretty sure was illegal. I forwarded the contracts to the lawyer. He called me back the same day and said I had just handed him a smoking gun. He told me to keep my head down, do not engage with Tiffany, and let him handle the next steps. I told him that was going to be hard, because Tiffany was already escalating again. The HOA plow had left a line of ice chunks along the curb in front of my house after the last storm. They were the size of softballs, frozen solid, and sitting right where I needed to walk to get to my mailbox. I ignored them for a day because I was dealing with everything else, and then Tiffany showed up again. She knocked on my door, did not wait for me to answer, and started yelling through the glass that I needed to break up the ice immediately, or she would fine me for creating a slip hazard. I opened the door and pointed out that the HOA plow had left the ice there, not me. She said that did not matter. Property owners were responsible for clearing all walkways adjacent to their property, and if I did not handle it by end of day, the fine would be $150. I asked her how I was supposed to break up ice that her plow had compacted into concrete hard blocks. She said that was my problem, not hers. Then she took another photo and walked away. I grabbed the small, collapsible snow pusher and a metal scraper and went outside. I spent 40 minutes chipping away at the ice chunks, breaking them into smaller pieces and shoving them into the snowbank. My back was killing me by the time I finished. I could feel my father watching from the window, worried. When I came back inside, he asked me why I did not just pay the fines and move on. I told him I could not do that because if I gave Tiffany an inch, she would take everything. He nodded, but I could see he did not really understand. He had grown up in a time when neighbors worked things out over coffee, not through lawyers and enforcement committees. This was a different world. The next board meeting was scheduled for mid-February. I marked it on my calendar and started preparing my presentation. The lawyer helped me draft a statement that laid out every violation notice, every bogus fine, every vendor overcharge, and every piece of evidence that tied Tiffany to financial misconduct. I printed 30 copies and put them in a binder. I was not just going to read a complaint. I was going to bring a printed evidence packet and slide copies to the board and the room at once. I wanted everyone to see the numbers, the contracts, the pattern. I wanted the board to understand that Tiffany was not protecting the neighborhood. She was exploiting it. If you are hooked on this HOA chaos, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next disaster story. 2 days before the meeting, Tiffany tried one more escalation. A contractor showed up at my door with a tire clamp device. He said he was there to immobilize my vehicle until I paid my outstanding fines. I asked him who sent him. He said the HOA. I asked him if he had a court order or a signed work order from the board. He said he did not need one. He had authorization from the enforcement coordinator. I pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency police line. I told the dispatcher that someone was attempting to clamp my car without legal authority. She said an officer would be on the way. The contractor got nervous. He said he was just doing his job. I told him his job was illegal without a court order, and if he touched my car, I would file a theft report. He put the clamp back in his truck and left before the officer even arrived. The officer showed up 10 minutes later, I explained the situation and showed him the vendor contracts, the violation notices, and the timeline. He took notes and said this was a civil matter, but that the contractor had no authority to clamp a vehicle on private property without a court order. He said I should file a complaint with the city if the HOA tried this again. I thanked him and asked if he could write up an incident report. He said yes, and he handed me a slip with the report number. I added it to my evidence folder. That night, I got a call from Eric. He said Tiffany was telling people at the clubhouse that I had threatened a contractor and that she was pushing the board to file a restraining order against me. I told Eric that was a lie, and I had a police report that proved it. He said he believed me, but that Tiffany was good at spinning stories, and I needed to be ready for her to try something big at the meeting. The night before the meeting, I could not sleep. I kept going over the timeline, the contracts, the photos, the witness statements. I had everything I needed to prove that Tiffany had been running a scheme to inflate vendor bills and pocket kickbacks. I had proof that she had enforced rules that did not exist. I had proof that she had harassed multiple homeowners, not just me. But I also knew that the board might not care. They might decide that keeping Tiffany was easier than admitting they had let her run wild for 2 years. I had to be ready for that. The meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening at the clubhouse. I showed up 15 minutes early with my binder and my evidence folder. The clubhouse exterior steps and entry sidewalk were already crowded with people arriving. I saw Tiffany near the door, talking to another board member, and she shot me a look that could have frozen the ground. I ignored her and found a spot near the side of the steps where I could see everyone coming in. Eric showed up a few minutes later. He gave me a tiny nod but did not come over to talk. A few other neighbors I had spoken to arrived and stood in a loose group near the entrance. The tension was thick. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. The board president called the meeting to order at 7 on the dot. We were standing outside on the steps because the clubhouse interior was closed for maintenance, which I suspected was Tiffany's doing to keep the meeting uncomfortable and short. The president went through the standard agenda, approvals, budgets, maintenance updates, and then opened the floor for homeowner comments. I raised my hand. Tiffany immediately objected, saying I was not allowed to speak because I had outstanding fines. The president looked confused and asked for clarification. I said I was contesting the fines. They were not valid, and I had documentation. Tiffany said that did not matter. I was in non-compliance and therefore barred from participation. The president hesitated. I could see he did not want to deal with this. I stepped forward and said I had evidence of financial misconduct that the board needed to see before they made any decision about my standing. That got everyone's attention. Tiffany went pale. The president asked me what I was talking about. I opened the binder and started handing out copies. One to the president, one to each board member, one to the management company rep who had just arrived, and then I started passing them to the neighbors standing around us. Tiffany tried to grab one of the copies out of my hand. I pulled it back and handed it to the person behind her. She started yelling that I was disrupting the meeting, that I was spreading false information, that I was violating meeting rules. The president told her to calm down and let me finish. I took a breath and started talking. I laid out the vendor contracts, the kickback clause in the towing agreement, the inflated billing from the plow company, the salt vendor overcharges. I showed the board the timeline of Tiffany's enforcement actions against me and 4 other homeowners, all of whom had questioned her authority. I showed them the fake emergency rules she had been enforcing without a board vote. I showed them the police report from the tire clamp incident. And then I showed them the invoice trail that proved Tiffany had been receiving payments from the towing contractor under the table, routed through a shell LLC that shared her home address. That was the trump card. I had been holding it back, waiting for the right moment, because I knew that once I played it, there was no walking it back. I acted like I was backing down, because timing was the whole weapon. Tiffany tried to deny everything. She said the contracts were approved by the board, that the payments were legitimate reimbursements, that I was lying. But Eric stood up and said he had been asking about those contracts for months, and Tiffany had refused to provide details. Another board member said she had never seen a vote on emergency winter rules. A neighbor shouted that Tiffany had tried to fine him twice for the same violation. The president held up his hand and said this needed to be investigated immediately, and that all enforcement actions would be frozen pending a full audit. Tiffany lost it. She started screaming that nobody appreciated her work, that she had been protecting the neighborhood from people like me, that this was a witch hunt. The president told her to step outside. She refused. He said if she did not leave voluntarily, he would call the police. She finally stormed off, but not before turning back and shouting that I would regret this. The president apologized to everyone and said the meeting was adjourned until further notice. People started talking all at once, some of them coming up to me to thank me, others just staring in shock. Eric caught my eye and gave me a real smile for the first time. I closed the binder and walked back to my car. The fallout was fast. The management company launched an audit the next day. The board voted to suspend Tiffany from all enforcement duties pending the results. 2 weeks later, the audit confirmed everything I had documented. The plow company had been overbilling by 40%. The salt vendor had been delivering half the contracted amounts and charging full price. The towing contractor had been paying Tiffany a 10% kickback on every tow, funneled through an LLC she had set up in her husband's name. The total was over $30,000 in 2 years. The management company fired the vendors, terminated their contracts, and referred Tiffany to the state attorney general for investigation. The board voted to remove her from her position and banned her from serving on the board in the future. But I was not done. I wanted my money back, I wanted a no-contact order, and I wanted the winter enforcement rules rewritten so this could never happen again. My lawyer drafted a settlement demand. The HOA fought it for a month, trying to lowball me with a partial refund and a generic apology. I refused. I told them I would take it to court if they did not agree to full restitution, a written no-contact directive, and a policy overhaul with penalties for violations. They finally caved. The settlement included full fee refunds for me and the 4 other homeowners Tiffany had targeted, a formal no-contact order that prohibited Tiffany from contacting any of us or setting foot on our properties, and a complete rewrite of the winter enforcement policy with an independent review process and penalties for retaliatory actions. The board also agreed to post the audit results in the newsletter and on the website, so everyone in the neighborhood could see what had been going on. Tiffany tried to fight the no-contact order. She filed a motion claiming I had defamed her. The judge read my evidence packet, looked at the audit, and denied her motion in under 5 minutes. She tried to appeal. The appeals court threw it out. She tried to sue the management company for wrongful termination from the board. That case was dismissed too. Every move she made just dug her deeper. Her credibility collapsed in front of witnesses, exactly the way it needed to. The new winter enforcement policy went into effect in March. It required photographic evidence with timestamps, mandatory review by 2 board members before any fine could be issued, and a formal appeals process that included a neutral third party. It also banned vendor kickbacks, required competitive bidding on all contracts over $5,000, and imposed financial penalties on any board member found to be self-dealing. The HOA hired a new enforcement coordinator, a retired postal worker, who actually read the rules before trying to apply them. The neighborhood felt different after that. People were not scared to shovel their driveways or park in front of their own houses anymore. The board started holding open budget meetings. The vendor contracts were posted online for anyone to review. It was not perfect, but it was 1,000 times better than it had been under Tiffany. I kept the evidence folder on my shelf for another year, just in case. Tiffany moved out of the neighborhood 6 months after the settlement. I heard she tried to join another HOA board across town, but someone recognized her name and flagged the audit report. She did not get the position. Eric stayed on the board and eventually became vice president. He thanked me a few times for forcing the issue, but he also admitted he should have spoken up sooner. I told him I did not blame him. Tiffany had built a system where fear was the default, and breaking that system required someone who had nothing left to lose. My father stayed with me through the spring. By the time his hip had healed enough for him to go back to his own place, the HOA drama was over, and he could finally relax. He told me he was proud of me for standing up, but he also said he hoped I never had to go through something like that again. I told him I hoped so too, but that I had learned an important lesson. HOAs only have as much power as you give them. The moment you start documenting, asking questions, and refusing to back down, the whole thing falls apart. It is not easy. It is stressful and expensive, and it takes time. But it works. The Commons at Ridgeview is a different place now. The new board actually listens to complaints. The vendors do not overcharge anymore because they know someone is watching. And the winter rules are clear, fair, and enforced evenly. I still see neighbors from that night on the clubhouse steps, and we all share a little nod when we pass each other. We know what we went through. We know what it took to fix it. And we know that if it ever starts to slide back, we will be ready. I still use that small, collapsible snow pusher every winter. It has become a kind of symbol for me, a reminder that you do not need fancy tools or a law degree to fight back. You just need patience, evidence, and the willingness to stand in the cold and do the work. Tiffany tried to break me with bogus fines and fake emergencies, but all she did was teach me how the system worked and how to beat it. The HOA froze enforcement pending a policy rewrite, exactly the way it should have happened from the start. The kickback scheme collapsed. The vendors lost their contracts. And Karen, or Tiffany, or whatever name you want to call her, lost everything she had built. Her credibility collapsed in front of witnesses, and there was no coming back from that. The lawyer who helped me with the settlement told me I should write everything down, not for revenge, but so other people could learn from it. He said most HOA disputes never make it to the finish line because people give up halfway through. They pay the bogus fine, they move out, they just accept that the system is broken and move on. But if enough people fight back, document everything, and force accountability, the system changes. That is what happened here. One snow pile, one staged photo, one vindictive board member, and 2 years of harassment turned into a full financial audit, a policy overhaul, and a settlement that protected not just me, but everyone else she had targeted. It was not instant karma. It was slow, deliberate, and backed by a paper trail that she could not talk her way out of. I kept one piece of evidence on my desk long after everything was over. It was the chunk of compacted slush I had scraped off the sidewalk that first morning. the one that Tiffany claimed was a hazard. I had saved it in a plastic bag in the freezer like it was evidence in a criminal case, and when the audit results came back, I almost sent it to her with a note. But I did not. I just let it melt. Some fights you win by staying quiet and letting the proof speak for itself. The neighborhood is quiet now. The snow gets plowed on schedule. The ice gets cleared without drama. And when someone new moves in and asks about the HOA rules, we tell them the truth. It is not perfect, but it is accountable, and that makes all the difference. Tiffany is gone, her vendor friends are gone, and the culture of fear she built is gone with them. What is left is a neighborhood where people can shovel their driveways, park their cars, and live their lives without worrying that some petty enforcer is going to show up with a clipboard and a tow truck. I still work nights at the terminal, still deal with chaos and meltdowns and unreasonable demands. But none of it feels as personal as that winter with Tiffany. She made it personal. She tried to intimidate me, bankrupt me, and run me out of my own home. And she lost. Not because I was smarter, or richer, or more connected, but because I refused to give up, and I documented everything. That is the lesson. You do not need to be a lawyer, or a board member, or some kind of activist to fight back against an abusive HOA. You just need proof, patience, and the guts to stand your ground when someone tries to steamroll you. More HOA chaos soon.